In a Chicago courtroom, Raymond L. Hayes, a homeless veteran, faces minor charges for loitering. Silent and unrepresented, his presence seems routine until Judge Nora Bennett reads his name and pauses, shaken. The courtroom falls silent as she reveals a connection. Decades ago, a soldier from Raymond's unit saved her life in Vietnam. As details of his heroic past, Silver Star, Purple Heart, emerge, questions swirl. Why is a war hero homeless? What broke the system that failed him? The truth unravels, hinting at a forgotten sacrifice in a judge's personal debt, leaving the audience craving resolution. Support QH Incredible Stories. Subscribe to uncover more powerful tales of truth and justice. Share this story with someone who believes in doing what's right. Your support gives meaning to these stories, inspiring hope and change. Join us to honor unsung heroes like Raymond. Thank you. On a frigid Tuesday morning in late January, a delicate veil of snow dusted the streets of downtown Chicago, cloaking the city in a quiet, fleeting softness. The temperature had plummeted overnight, transforming sidewalks into treacherous sheets of ice that glistened under the pale streetlights. Raymond L. Hayes, a man who had become as much a part of the city's fabric as its towering skyscrapers, made his way to his familiar perch outside the public library. At roughly 75 years old, his once robust frame had been whittled down by time and hardship, leaving him gaunt, his tall silhouette almost spectral. His long white hair, tangled and unwashed, spilled out from beneath a faded military cap that clung to its last threads of color, a relic of a lifelong past. The oversized army jacket draped over his bony shoulders seemed to carry the weight of decades, its frayed edges and worn patches whispering stories no one bothered to hear. Yet, despite the biting cold, Raymond moved with purpose, brushing snow from his usual bench with a careful hand before settling into his silent vigil. For 15 years, Raymond had claimed this spot, a quiet sentinel amidst the city's relentless pulse. Unlike others who roamed the streets, he never begged, never raised his voice, never intruded on the hurried lives of passersby. His presence was unobtrusive, almost invisible, save for the small rituals that defined his days. In a tattered notebook, he scribbled thoughts with a pencil stub he kept tucked behind his ear, his handwriting shaky but deliberate. Sometimes he'd pluck a discarded book from the library's outdoor return cart, his weathered fingers tracing the pages as his eyes scanned the words with a quiet reverence before returning the book to its place. The library staff had grown fond of him in their own understated way. On mornings when the wind howled and frost clung to the air, a few would offer a nod or leave a steaming cup of coffee near his bench, a small gesture of warmth for a man who seemed to ask for nothing. That morning, as the snow fell in soft, persistent flakes, Raymond's breath hung in the air, a faint cloud of warmth in the freezing dawn. Perhaps to ward off the cold that seeped into his bones, he began to hum, his voice low and gravelly, shaping the notes of an old military cadence. The sound was soft, almost swallowed by the city's hum, but it carried a weight of memory, a flicker of pride, of camaraderie, of a life that once marched to a different rhythm. He sang to himself, lost in thought, unaware that his quiet melody would soon unravel the fragile piece of his routine. A new security guard, recently hired by the library, stood at his post, his eyes narrowing as he watched Raymond. To him, the old man's presence was a blemish on the library's polished image, a deterrent to patrons who might shy away from the sight of a homeless man lingering on the steps. The guard's discomfort grew as Raymond's soft singing continued, a sound he deemed disruptive, though it barely reached beyond the bench. With a quick call to the police, he reported a vagrant causing a disturbance, his voice tinged with the self-assurance of someone new to authority. The complaint set in motion a chain of events that would pull Raymond from his quiet world into the cold machinery of the law. 2 officers arrived, their boots crunching on the icy sidewalk. Officer Jenkins, a rookie with only 6 months on the force, approached with a mix of caution and unease. His training had prepared him for confrontation, but Raymond offered none. "Sir," Jenkins said, his voice firm but laced with uncertainty, "we've received complaints about loitering and noise. I'm going to need some identification." Raymond lifted his gaze slowly, his face a map of creases and shadows, etched by years of sun and sorrow. He said nothing, his silence heavy but not defiant. Reaching into his jacket, he produced a plastic card so worn it was illegible, its edges cracked and faded from years of exposure. Jenkins frowned, holding the card up to the dim light. "This isn't valid ID, sir. Do you have anything else?" Raymond shook his head, his eyes drifting back to the ground. The officer shifted uncomfortably, his breath visible in the cold. "You can't stay here. City ordinances don't allow loitering in public spaces." When Raymond didn't respond, Jenkins's voice softened, almost apologetic. "I'm going to have to ask you to come with us." Raymond complied without a word. He closed his notebook with care, tucking it inside his jacket as if it were a treasure, and rose from the bench, his movements slow and deliberate. The officers, braced for resistance, exchanged glances at his quiet acquiescence. As they escorted him to the patrol car, Raymond's steps were steady but heavy, each one carrying the weight of a life that had long since slipped through society's cracks. At the precinct, he was processed with the detached efficiency reserved for the city's forgotten, photographed, fingerprinted, and assigned a court date for the next morning. No one noticed the dog paws nestled beneath his layers of clothing, their faint clink drowned out by the clamor of the station. In the holding cell, Raymond sat motionless on a bench, his eyes fixed on a point beyond the concrete walls, as if tracing the outlines of a memory only he could see. The cold of the cell seeped into his joints, but he didn't flinch, his stillness a quiet rebellion against the world that had brought him here. The next morning, the municipal courtroom buzzed with the chaos of minor offenses, public intoxication, shoplifting, traffic violations, and the usual roster of charges leveled against the city's homeless. Raymond's case was the last on the docket, a footnote in a long list of grievances. Judge Nora Bennett, a woman of 61 with salt and pepper hair pulled into a severe bun, presided with the efficiency of someone who had seen it all. Her 20 years on the bench had honed her into a figure of authority, her no-nonsense demeanor softened only by a reputation for fairness. Behind her reading glasses, her eyes scanned case files with practiced precision, her expression unyielding as she navigated the courtroom's endless parade of petty crimes. The room itself was stifling, filled with the murmur of whispered conversations and the rustle of papers. In the gallery, Sarah Martinez, a young legal intern, scribbled notes for her law school practicum, her pen moving quickly as she observed the proceedings with a mix of curiosity and quiet ambition. When Raymond's case was called, he didn't stir. The bailiff, a burly man with a gentle touch, tapped his shoulder. "They're calling you, sir," he said softly. Raymond rose, his movements stiff from arthritis and the chill of the holding cell. As he shuffled toward the front, a faint odor of unwashed clothes in the street trailed behind him, prompting a few spectators to wrinkle their noses in discomfort. Yet Raymond stood with a quiet dignity, his shoulders squared despite the weight of his circumstances. Judge Bennett flipped through his files, her fingers pausing as she read the name on the page. "Raymond L. Hayes," she began, but her voice faltered, catching in her throat like a note held too long. The courtroom fell silent, the air thick with an unspoken question. Why would a simple name, a name belonging to a man so easily overlooked, bring a judge to a halt, as if the weight of it carried the solemnity of a memorial? The air in the courtroom hung heavy with the musty scent of unwashed clothes, a silent testament to the struggles of the man standing before the bench, Raymond L. Hayes stood there, his weathered face betraying little of the storm that might have been raging within. If he noticed the subtle recoils or stifled glances from those around him, he gave no sign, his eyes fixed somewhere distant, as if tethered to a memory just out of reach. The weight of his presence seemed to pull the room into a strange stillness, where even the rustle of papers felt intrusive. Judge Nora Bennett, a woman whose 2 decades on the bench had forged an unshakable mask of impartiality, lifted the case file with a practiced motion, her eyes scanning the page without truly seeing it. Case number 47293, Commonwealth versus... Her voice faltered, the words dissolving into a stone silence as her gaze caught the name printed in stark black ink. When she looked up, her face had paled, the color draining as if some unseen force had siphoned it away. Her lips parted, and with a voice that trembled in a way that felt foreign to her own ears, she asked, "Your name is Raymond L. Hayes?" The courtroom fell into a profound hush, as though the world itself had paused to listen. The weight of that silence pressed against every occupant, a reminder that when all else turned away, when judgment and scorn filled the air, only conscience remained to bear witness. For Judge Bennett, that conscience was now a roaring presence, clawing at the edges of her carefully constructed composure. She had spent years cultivating a demeanor of steel, a necessity for delivering justice without the cloud of personal bias. But now, staring at the disheveled man before her, something deep within her stirred, a memory, a debt, a moment from a lifetime ago that refused to stay buried. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice softening to a tone that those familiar with her courtroom had never heard, a gentleness that seemed to surprise even herself. She steadied her breath, forcing calm into her words. "Did you serve in the military?" Raymond's vacant stare shifted, a faint spark igniting behind his tired eyes. His voice, rough and gravelly from years of disuse, rasped out, "Yes, ma'am." The simplicity of his response carried a weight that seemed to anchor him, if only for a moment, to the present. Judge Bennett leaned forward slightly, her hands abandoning the case file entirely. "Where did you serve?" she pressed, her tone carrying an urgency that made the prosecutor, who had been lazily skimming his notes, snap to attention. "Alpha Company, 17th Special Forces Group, Pleiku Province, Vietnam," Raymond replied, his words mechanical, as if drawn from a script etched into his soul, a script he could recite even as other memories slipped through his fingers like sand. The silence in the courtroom deepened, an almost tangible tension wrapping around every onlooker. The prosecutor's pen froze mid-scribble, his earlier disinterest replaced by a sudden, sharp focus. Judge Bennett's hand moved to the pocket of her robe, her fingers closing around a small, familiar object. She withdrew it slowly. A medallion worn smooth by years of quiet handling, encased in clear plastic to preserve its faded surface. Her eyes lingered on it, and for a moment she was no longer the unyielding judge, but a woman caught in the undertow of her past. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I was rescued by a soldier from that exact unit when I was a child. He carried me 3 kilometers to safety during a mortar attack. I never knew his name, but I've kept his unit medallion all these years." Her words hung in the air, fragile and heavy, as if speaking them aloud had made her vulnerable in a way she hadn't been in decades. The court clerk, sensing the gravity of the moment, began typing rapidly, pulling up records on his computer. "Your Honor," he said, his voice cutting through the stillness, "our records confirm he is Raymond Lawrence Hayes, Staff Sergeant, honorably discharged in 1980. A young intern, Sarah, who had been quietly observing from the side, raised her hand with a hesitance that belied her curiosity. When Judge Bennett nodded, granting permission, Sarah stood, her voice steady but laced with awe. "Your Honor, if I may, I have access to the military service database from my pre-law veterans advocacy course. Mr. Hayes received both the Silver Star and the Purple Heart, the former for leading an extraction of wounded soldiers under heavy fire, the latter for injuries sustained while shielding his comrades during an ambush." Judge Bennett removed her glasses, revealing eyes that shimmered with unshed tears. The courtroom, so accustomed to her stoic presence, seemed to hold its breath. "When I was 8 years old," she began, her voice thick with emotion, "my family was caught in crossfire during a trip to visit relatives at a medical outpost near the Vietnamese border. In the chaos, I was separated from my parents. I ended up hiding in a drainage ditch, terrified, alone, certain I wouldn't survive." She paused, her fingers tightening around the medallion as she fought to maintain her composure. "A soldier found me. He pulled me from that ditch and carried me through active combat zones, shielding me as mortars exploded around us. When we reached safety, he pressed this medallion into my hand and told me to stay brave. 2 days later, my parents found me at a field hospital. I never knew his name, only that he was from a Special Forces unit, but I've never forgotten his eyes." Her gaze locked onto Raymond's face, searching for something, recognition, perhaps, or confirmation of a truth she had carried for decades. "Those same eyes are looking at me right now," she said, her voice breaking slightly. Raymond's expression remained largely impassive, but a faint flicker passed through his gaze, like a candle struggling to stay lit in a storm. The weight of her words seemed to stir something within him, though whether it was memory or merely instinct was unclear. "Do you remember Cam Ranh Bay, 1968? Judge Bennett asked, her voice so soft it barely reached the edges of the room. A little girl, separated from her family? Raymond's brow furrowed, his eyes narrowing as though trying to peer through the fog of his fractured memory. Many children, he said slowly, his voice distant. We tried to help them all. The police officer who had brought Raymond in shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face a mixture of guilt and disbelief. He leaned toward his partner, his whisper barely audible. Did we just arrest a war hero? Sarah, still standing, continued her research, her fingers flying across her tablet. Your Honor, there's more in his service record. After Vietnam, Mr. Hayes served as a training officer until his discharge. He then worked as an interstate bus driver for nearly a decade. She paused, her expression darkening as she scrolled further. There's a gap in his records after 1994. It seems he was involved in a serious collision when another vehicle struck his bus. He suffered significant head trauma. Medical notes mention memory impairment, particularly. What happened? Judge Bennett interrupted, her question directed not just to Raymond, but to the entire room, as if pleading for an explanation of how a man who had once carried a child to safety could now stand before her, broken and forgotten. Her eyes lingered on Raymond, searching for the soldier he had been, the man whose courage had shaped her life in ways he could never have known. In the quiet hum of the courtroom, Raymond Hayes stood at the defendant's table, his weathered hands clasped loosely in front of him, his gaze distant, as though peering through the fog of decades past. The charges against him, petty theft, vagrancy, felt like cruel footnotes to a life that had once burned with purpose. His mind, frayed by time and trauma, struggled to piece together the accusations, let alone the fragments of his own history. The court officer, a Vietnam veteran himself, leaned against the wall, his eyes tracing the lines of Raymond's gaunt frame. He saw something familiar in the slump of those shoulders, the quiet endurance etched into the man's face. Stepping forward, his voice steady but laced with empathy, he addressed the judge. Your Honor, if I may, many veterans from that era got lost in the system's chaos. Paperwork went missing, records got tangled. If Mr. Hayes was battling memory issues, he could have slipped through the cracks, especially if he couldn't keep up with the VA's demands. His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of unspoken stories. Raymond nodded faintly, a gesture so subtle it seemed more reflex than agreement, as if he were grasping at threads of a life he could only half remember. Judge Evelyn Bennett, perched on the bench, felt a tremor of recognition ripple through her. Her sharp, practiced gaze softened as she studied Raymond. The man before her was a shadow of someone she once knew, a figure from a time when fear and courage had intertwined in her heart. She leaned forward, her voice cutting through the courtroom's murmurs. Mr. Hayes, do you have any family we could reach out to? Her tone was gentle, almost pleading, as though she were reaching across years to pull him back from the void. Raymond's head shook slowly, his eyes clouded with a quiet sorrow. They're gone now, he said, his voice a low rasp, offering no further explanation. The simplicity of his words struck the room like a muted bell, stirring a collective ache among those listening. The prosecutor, a young man whose ambition usually outpaced his compassion, rose, sensing the shift in the room's gravity. Your Honor, given these unique circumstances, the Commonwealth requests a continuance to reevaluate the charges. His voice carried a rare note of deference, as if he too felt the weight of Raymond's unseen scars. Judge Bennett nodded, her mind racing with memories she hadn't touched in years. Then, in a move that stunned the courtroom, she declared, "This court will suspend proceedings against Mr. Hayes immediately. He does not belong in the defendant's chair." A ripple of murmurs spread, like wind stirring a still lake. The officer who had arrested Raymond, a man accustomed to seeing the world in black and white, suddenly found the floor infinitely fascinating, his eyes fixed on his polished shoes as shame crept into his chest. But Bennett wasn't finished. Furthermore, she continued, her voice steady but charged with emotion, I am recusing myself from this case due to a personal connection with the defendant. The courtroom fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Then, defying decades of judicial protocol, she stepped down from the bench, a first in her long, storied career, and approached Raymond. Standing before him, Judge Bennett seemed to shed the weight of her robes. Her small frame, usually so commanding, now carried a vulnerability that made her seem younger, as if the years had peeled back to reveal the woman she'd been decades ago. Her voice trembled as she spoke, her professional mask slipping away. "I never got to thank you properly, Raymond. That medallion you gave me, I carried it through law school, through my first cases, through every moment I doubted myself. When the world felt too heavy, I'd hold it and remember what true courage looks like. You gave me that." Her words were a confession, a bridge between their shared past and this improbable present. Raymond's eyes, dulled by years of hardship, flickered with something. Recognition, perhaps, or the ghost of pride. His hand rose slowly, not quite touching his forehead, but tracing the outline of a salute, a gesture from a life long buried. "Just doing my job, ma'am," he murmured, his voice soft but steady, echoing a mantra that had once defined him. "No one gets left behind." The words, simple yet profound, seemed to pull at the heartstrings of everyone in the room, a reminder of a promise kept in the chaos of war. Judge Bennett's eyes glistened, but she quickly regained her composure, calling for a 30-minute recess. "Contact the VA's emergency response team," she instructed her clerk, her voice firm but urgent. "Tell them we have a priority situation involving a decorated Vietnam veteran. And get me someone from the Veterans Legal Aid Society, now." As the courtroom emptied, whispers buzzing like static, Bennett did something even more extraordinary. She guided Raymond to her chambers, a breach of protocol that left court officers exchanging stunned glances. Sarah, the young intern who had been quietly observing, was beckoned to join them. "You seem to know your way around military databases," Bennett said, her tone clipped but kind. "We'll need that skill." In the privacy of her chambers, the judge abandoned all pretense of formality. She poured Raymond a cup of coffee, which he held in trembling hands, staring at it as though it were a foreign object. His fingers, rough and calloused, betrayed the years spent surviving on the margins. "Hayes," Bennett said softly, sitting across from him, "I'm going to help you, but I need to understand what happened after your accident. How did a man who served his country with such honor end up on the streets?" Her voice was gentle, but beneath it lay a fierce determination to unravel the mystery of his fall. Raymond's response came in halting fragments, each word a struggle against the fatigue in his mind. "Headaches started, couldn't focus on the road, lost my license, then the apartment." His hands gestured vaguely as if trying to map a timeline he could no longer see clearly. His eyes, though, carried a quiet resignation, as if he'd long accepted the world's indifference. Sarah, her fingers flying across her tablet, looked up with a spark of discovery. "Your Honor, I found something. VA records show Mr. Hayes was receiving disability payments until 1997, when they stopped abruptly. There's a note about failure to respond to certification requests and return mail. Recipient unknown." Her voice trembled with a mix of excitement and outrage. Bennett's jaw tightened, her frustration palpable. "A bureaucratic black hole," she muttered, her mind racing through the implications. If he couldn't remember to update his address or navigate the paperwork, the system would have just erased him. Sarah nodded, her youthful idealism clashing with the reality of Raymond's plight. Exactly. He vanished from their radar. Outside the chambers, the story was already taking on a life of its own. A court reporter, moved by the morning's events, had tipped off his editor about a potential human interest piece. Judge halts trial after recognizing homeless defendant as war hero. By midday, local news outlets had picked up the story, and by evening, it would capture national attention with headlines like, "Judge recognizes homeless man as soldier who saved her life." The courtroom, when it reconvened, was no longer a quiet space of routine justice. The gallery had swelled with reporters, veterans advocates, and curious onlookers, all drawn to the unfolding drama of a forgotten hero rediscovered. For Raymond, though, the growing attention felt distant, like a storm on the horizon he couldn't quite see. His world for now was the warmth of the coffee in his hands, in the faint, flickering memory of a time when he'd been more than a shadow. The courtroom buzzed with a restless energy, a mix of reporters scribbling notes, curious onlookers whispering among themselves, and a palpable sense of anticipation. Judge Nora Bennett, her usual black robe replaced by a ceremonial one reserved for the court's most significant occasions, stood at the center of it all. The deep burgundy fabric draped over her shoulders carried a weight of solemnity, reflecting the gravity of the moment. Her dark eyes, sharp yet softened by years of witnessing human struggles, scanned the room. Beside her stood two representatives from the Department of Veterans Affairs, their faces etched with a mix of bureaucratic efficiency and quiet unease. To her left was a silver-haired man, his posture rigid with military precision, dressed in a suit so impeccably tailored it seemed to embody his disciplined past. Introduced as Colonel James Whitmore, retired now with the Veterans Legal Defense Alliance, he carried an air of quiet authority, his lined face revealing a man who had seen both the best and worst of humanity. Judge Bennett cleared her throat, her voice steady but laced with a tremor of emotion that betrayed her personal investment in the case. "Before we proceed," she began, her words cutting through the hum of the courtroom, "I wish to make a statement for the record. This morning's proceedings have brought to light information of profound importance regarding the defendant, Raymond Lawrence Hayes." Her gaze briefly met Raymond's, who sat at the defense table, his weathered hands folded, his eyes distant yet alert, as though trying to piece together a puzzle only he could see. She gestured toward Colonel Whitmore, who rose with a slow, deliberate grace. Whitmore's voice, gravelly but commanding, filled the room. "After an exhaustive review of classified records," he said, "we can confirm that Staff Sergeant Raymond Lawrence Hayes was a key operative in a covert mission known as Operation Rising Fog in 1970. His words landed like a stone in still water, rippling through the courtroom. This operation involved the high-risk extraction of American prisoners of war from a facility just across the Laotian border. It remained classified until 2008, meaning Sergeant Hayes was prohibited from publicly acknowledging his role or sacrifices." The murmurs in the room grew louder, a wave of shock and indignation rolling through the crowd. Reporters exchanged glances, their pens moving faster, while onlookers leaned forward, hanging on every word. Raymond, however, remained still, his expression unreadable, as though the weight of his past was too heavy to react to in the moment. Judge Bennett resumed, her voice now carrying a steely resolve. "Furthermore, preliminary investigations have confirmed that Mr. Hayes suffered a traumatic brain injury in 1994, resulting in significant memory impairment. This injury likely rendered him unable to navigate the complex bureaucratic systems required to maintain his veterans' benefits and secure stable housing." Her words were measured, but beneath them lay a quiet fury, not at any one person, but at a system that had let a hero slip through its cracks. Raymond's eyes flickered briefly, a spark of recognition or perhaps pain, though he said nothing. In his mind, fragments of memories swirled, flashes of gunfire, the weight of a child in his arms, the chaos of war, but they were fleeting, like shadows on a wall. The prosecutor, a young man named Daniel Carter, who had been half dozing through earlier proceedings, now stood bolt upright, his face pale with the sudden realization of the case's magnitude. "Your Honor," he said, his voice catching slightly, "in light of these extraordinary circumstances, the Commonwealth moves to dismiss all charges against the Mr. Hayes with prejudice." The words were formal, but his tone carried a mix of shame and urgency, as though he too felt the sting of the injustice laid bare. "So ordered," Judge Bennett replied with odd hesitation, her gavel striking with a finality that echoed through the room. But she wasn't finished. Leaning forward, her hands clasped tightly, she continued, "This court will not rest at merely dismissing charges. A grave injustice has been done here, not by any single individual, but by a system that failed to honor a man who gave everything for his country." Her voice trembled with conviction, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. Raymond's gaze dropped to his hands, his fingers tracing invisible patterns, as though searching for something solid in the haze of his fractured memory. The VA representative stepped forward, one of them holding a thick folder of documents that seemed to carry the weight of Raymond's lost years. "We've initiated emergency reinstatement procedures for Mr. Hayes's benefits," the older of the two said, his voice steady but tinged with regret. "Back payments will take additional time to process, but we've authorized immediate housing and medical assistance." His colleague, a younger woman with a clipboard, nodded in agreement, her eyes darting toward Raymond with a mix of sympathy and determination. For them, this was more than paperwork. It was a chance to right a wrong, even if belatedly. As the courtroom absorbed these developments, the story was already spiraling beyond its walls. On social media, the hashtag #HonorHayes began trending, a digital wildfire fueled by outrage and disbelief. Posts poured in, each one a cry of indignation that a decorated veteran had been left to wander the streets, homeless and facing criminal charges for survival. "This is America's shame," one post read, shared thousands of times. "How do we let a hero like Raymond Hayes fall so far?" another demanded. Veterans groups, alerted by the growing online storm, mobilized with astonishing speed. By mid-afternoon, representatives from 3 organizations had arrived at the courthouse, their faces a mix of resolve and sorrow. They offered housing solutions, medical care, and legal support to ensure Raymond's benefits were fully restored. Each representative seemed to carry a personal stake in the fight, their voices thick with the shared understanding of service and sacrifice. Outside the courthouse, a poignant scene unfolded. A group of active duty service members, in Chicago for training exercises, arrived in full-dress uniform. They stood at attention in a silent line, their faces stern yet reverent, a living tribute to a man they had never met, but whose story had struck a deep chord. The sight of them, standing under the gray afternoon sky, drew gasps from passersby and clicks from reporters' cameras. For the soldiers, it was a moment of solidarity, a way to honor one of their own who had been forgotten by the country they all served. Inside, Judge Bennett made a decision that broke with tradition. "This court will convene a special recognition session tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., she announced, her voice steady but warm. "While I have recused myself from Mr. Hayes' case, I will preside over this session not as a judge, but as a private citizen, and as someone whose life was touched by Mr. Hayes' courage." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and the room erupted in a low hum of surprise and approval. Raymond looked up, his brow furrowing slightly, as though trying to grasp the weight of her statement. That evening, Raymond was not returned to the cold uncertainty of a homeless shelter. Instead, he was escorted to a private room at the VA Medical Center, where doctors began a thorough evaluation of his physical and cognitive health. The sterile white walls and soft beeping of machines felt foreign to him, but the kindness in the nurse's eyes offered a flicker of comfort. The initial prognosis was cautiously hopeful. While some of his memory deficits appeared permanent, specialized therapy could help him reclaim fragments of his past and improve his daily life. Raymond sat quietly, his hands resting in his lap, his mind a jumble of half-remembered images. A burning village, a child's tear-streaked face, the weight of duty. He felt a strange mix of gratitude and disorientation, as though the world was finally seeing him after years of being invisible. Judge Bennett, her judicial duties complete for the day, made her way to the medical center. In her hand was a small medallion, its edges worn but its significance undimmed. She found Raymond in his room, sitting by the window, the city lights casting soft shadows across his face. "Do you remember giving this to me?" she asked gently, placing the medallion in his calloused palm. Raymond turned it over slowly, his fingers tracing its surface as though it might unlock something within him. His eyes clouded with effort, searching for a memory that flickered just out of reach. "Sometimes things come back in pieces," he said at last, his voice low and halting. "A village on fire, a little girl crying under a culvert. So many scared eyes." His words were fragmented, like shards of glass scattered across his mind. Bennett nodded, her throat tightening. "That was me," she said softly. "You told me to be brave, that help was coming. Then you carried me to safety." Her voice wavered, not with weakness, but with the weight of gratitude she had carried for decades. Raymond's gaze met hers, and for a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or simply the comfort of connection. "Just doing my job," he said, the phrase a reflex, a lifeline he clung to when memory failed him. "Your job saved my life," Bennett replied, her voice steady now, resolute. "And now, perhaps I can help save yours." The following morning, the courthouse was transformed. Hundreds had gathered, veterans in worn caps, active service members in crisp uniforms, reporters with cameras flashing, and ordinary citizens drawn by a story that had captured the nation's heart. The special session, announced by Judge Bennett, was not a legal proceeding, but a moment of collective reckoning. a chance to honor a man who had been failed by the system he served. As Raymond entered the room leaning slightly on a cane provided by the VA, the crowd rose to its feet, their applause a thunderous acknowledgement of his quiet heroism. For Raymond, the sound was overwhelming, a tidal wave crashing against the fragile shores of his memory. Yet in that moment, he felt seen, not as a forgotten veteran, but as a man whose life, though broken, still mattered. On a crisp morning in Chicago, Raymond Hayes stood before a courtroom, his weathered hands trembling slightly, though steadier than they had been the day prior. Decades of hardship had etched deep lines into his face, but his eyes held a quiet resilience, a flicker of the young soldier he once was. He wore clean clothes provided by a local veterans group, a stark contrast to the tattered garments he'd worn for years while living on the streets. The weight of his years of service, sacrifice, and loss, hung heavy in his heart. Yet today something extraordinary was unfolding. Judge Nora Bennett, dressed not in her judicial robes but in formal civilian attire, approached him with a gentleness that belied the gravity of the moment. In her hands was a gift long overdue, a properly documented identity. A team had labored through the night to assemble a complete package: birth certificate, social security card, military ID, and Veterans Affairs identification. Each document was a piece of a life nearly erased by time and neglect. "Mr. Hayes," Judge Bennett said, her voice steady but laced with emotion, "on behalf of a grateful nation and one particularly grateful woman who, as an 8-year-old girl, was given a chance at life because of your courage, I return to you your identity and your honor, though the latter you never truly lost." Her words carried the weight of personal gratitude, for Raymond had once saved her life in a distant war-torn land, an act of heroism buried under years of forgotten memories and bureaucratic failures. As she handed him the documents, Raymond's hands shook, not from weakness, but from the overwhelming realization that he was being seen, truly seen, for the first time in decades. For a fleeting moment, his posture shifted. Shoulders squared, chin lifted, he stood as the staff sergeant he had once been, the young man who had faced unimaginable horrors with unwavering resolve. In his mind, fragmented memories of comrades lost and battles fought flickered like half-remembered dreams. But this moment grounded him, anchoring him to a present where his sacrifices were finally acknowledged. The courtroom, typically a place of judgment and procedure, became a stage for something far more profound. Judge Bennett stepped down from her bench, shedding the formality of her role. She extended her hand to Raymond, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of gratitude and humility. "Staff Sergeant Hayes," she said softly, "I cannot pass judgment on a man to whom I owe my life." The gesture was simple, yet it carried the weight of a shared history, a bond forged in the chaos of war and rediscovered in this unlikely setting. Raymond clasped her hand, his grip firm despite the years of struggle, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. The spectators, court staff, veterans advocates, and a few curious onlookers watched in reverent silence, aware they were witnessing a moment that transcended the ordinary workings of the legal system. The ripple effects of this special session reached far beyond the courthouse walls. By that afternoon, the Chicago City Council had convened an emergency meeting to review protocols for handling homeless veterans within the legal system. The mayor's office swiftly issued a directive mandating that police verify military service before processing any homeless individual for minor offenses, a policy born from the recognition that men like Raymond had slipped through the cracks for too long. But the most significant change came from the Veterans Affairs Department, which announced a new initiative named Operation Hayes. This program was designed to identify and support veterans with cognitive impairments, those who, like Raymond, had been failed by a system that should have protected them. It was a testament to the power of one man's story to expose a critical gap and inspire systemic change. Raymond's heart swelled with a quiet pride, not for himself, but for the possibility that others might now find the help he had been denied for so long. As Raymond prepared to leave the courthouse, surrounded by a newfound support network of advocates and fellow veterans, a reporter called out, "Mr. Hayes, how does it feel to be recognized after all these years?" He paused, his mind working deliberately, as it often did since the brain injury that had altered his life. The question stirred a cascade of emotions: relief, gratitude, and a lingering sorrow for the brothers in arms who never made it home. "I never came home looking for parades," he said at last, his voice steady and imbued with a quiet dignity. "Just a quiet place to remember my brothers who didn't make it back. Now maybe I can remember them properly." His words hung in the air, simple yet profound, a reflection of a man who had carried the weight of his service in silence for decades. 6 months later, Raymond's life had transformed in ways he could scarcely have imagined. He now lived in a small, tidy apartment within a veterans' supportive housing complex. The bare walls of his new home were now adorned with framed photographs and documents, each one a testament to a life of service that had nearly been forgotten. A black and white image of a young Raymond in uniform hung prominently, a reminder of the soldier he had been, while his newly issued military ID sat framed beside it, a symbol of his reclaimed identity. Each morning he sat at a small desk by the window, sunlight streaming in as he wrote in a leather-bound journal, a gift from Judge Bennett. His doctors had recommended journaling as a form of therapy, a way to capture memories that might otherwise slip away like sand through his fingers. With each entry, Raymond pieced together fragments of his wartime experiences and the years that followed, his words a bridge between the past and the present. These writings, raw and unfiltered, were being preserved in the National Veterans History Project archive, ensuring that his story and the stories of those he served with would endure. Outside the Chicago Public Library, where Raymond had once sat unnoticed on a weathered bench, a small bronze plaque now bore his name. Staff Sergeant Raymond L. Hayes, in honor of all veterans whose service must never be forgotten. The library staff had established a veterans outreach program, ensuring that those who sought shelter or information were met with resources and respect. The courtroom where Judge Bennett had recognized her long-ago rescuer was similarly commemorated, renamed the Hayes Chamber, a space dedicated to veterans' cases with trained advocates present at every proceeding. Its new motto, "Where justice bows to courage," served as a reminder of the day one man's story reshaped the system. Sarah Martinez, the law student whose research had uncovered Raymond's identity, found her life's purpose in his story. After graduating, she joined the Veterans Legal Defense Alliance, specializing in cases involving veterans with traumatic brain injuries. When training new interns, she often shared Raymond's story, her voice steady but passionate. "We don't judge people," she would say. "We judge our incomplete understanding of them." Her words echoed the lesson she had learned through Raymond, that every veteran carries a story, often hidden beneath layers of pain and neglect, waiting to be heard. Judge Bennett, too, remained a constant presence in Raymond's life. Every other Sunday, they met for coffee, their conversations a blend of quiet reflection and comfortable silences. Sometimes she brought old photographs from Vietnam, sourced from historical archives, to help him piece together the fragmented memories of his past. Each image was a thread, weaving together the tapestry of a life disrupted by war and time. On the anniversary of their courtroom reunion, local veterans organized a small ceremony in Raymond's honor. When asked to speak, he approached the microphone with hesitation, his words chosen with care. "A person's name," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment, "is sometimes an entire history we haven't yet learned." The room fell silent, absorbing the truth of his words. "Heroes aren't always found on pedestals," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "Sometimes they're sitting quietly in defendants' chairs, forgotten by the very world they help protect." Judge Bennett, seated in the front row, nodded, tears glistening in her eyes as she felt the depth of his sacrifice anew. Raymond's final words that day carried a quiet power that lingered in the hearts of all who heard them. "Listen before judging," he said, "for the silence of one who has endured may speak louder than any defense." These words, born from a life of struggle and redemption, were later engraved in bronze at the entrance to the Veterans Justice Center established in his name. They served as a reminder to all who entered. Behind every name lies a story, behind every silence lies a sacrifice, and within every judgment must first come understanding. For Raymond Hayes, justice had been delayed, but it was never absent. His story stood as a testament to the enduring power of recognition, compassion, and the unyielding resolve to do what is right.